the thunder of cannons, the smoke of muskets. This was the dawn of modern warfare. Imagine, if you will, a world without the loud bang of a gun. For a very long time, that was Europe. Wars were fought with sharp swords, long spears, and powerful bows. Knights in shining armor were the tanks of their day, and honestly, they were very hard to stop. But a new sound was coming, a sound that would change everything. This sound came from China in the form of a black powder. This gunpowder was a mix of different chemicals, and when you lit it, it exploded with great force. At first, it was used for fireworks, making beautiful displays in the sky. But soon enough, people realized this explosive power could be used for something far more deadly. The idea of gunpowder traveled slowly. It moved along the famous Silk Road, that network of trade routes connecting the East and the West. Merchants and travelers brought stories and samples of this strange new substance. European thinkers and alchemists were fascinated by it. They began to experiment, trying to understand how it worked and how they could make it even stronger. They weren't just thinking about fireworks anymore. They were thinking about weapons. They imagined a way to use this powder to throw a rock or a metal ball much faster and further than any person or machine could. This was really the birth of the idea of a gun. The very first guns were not very good, honestly. They were often just simple metal tubes, closed at one end. You would pour gunpowder down the barrel, push a small stone or metal ball on top, and light a fuse at the back. These early cannons and handguns were clumsy and dangerous. They could easily explode, killing the person trying to fire it. They were also very slow to reload. A good archer could shoot many arrows in the time it took to prepare one shot from an early firearm. Because of this, many military leaders thought they were just noisy toys and not serious weapons of war, but people kept working on them. Gunsmiths became highly skilled craftsmen. They learned how to make stronger barrels and more reliable ways to fire the weapon. The simple tube became a more complex machine. They developed matchlocks, which used a slow-burning cord to light the gunpowder. This made it easier and safer to fire. Kings and princes started to see the potential. A weapon that could punch through a knight's expensive armor or smash a castle wall was something worth investing in. The age of swords and shields was not over yet, but its end was now in sight, heralded by the smell of sulfur and the deafening crack of gunpowder. The musket was a game-changer on the battlefields of Europe. It was a long gun, fired from the shoulder, and it was heavier and more powerful than the earlier handguns, called arquebuses. Its real advantage was that it could be given to an ordinary person. You didn't need the lifelong training of a knight or a longbowman to use a musket. A farmer could be taught how to load and fire a musket in just a few weeks. This meant that kings and queens could build huge armies very quickly. They were no longer so reliant on the noble knights who had their own lands and power. The musket made the common soldier powerful. This new weapon completely changed how armies organized themselves. Before, armies were often a chaotic mix of different types of soldiers. Now, armies became more structured. Soldiers with muskets, called musketeers, became the core of the army. They were usually arranged in large blocks, called formations. They would stand shoulder to shoulder in long lines. This was super important. A single musket was slow to reload and not very accurate, but when hundreds of musketeers fired all at once, in a single volley, they created a wall of lead bullets. This wave of fire could stop almost any enemy attack in its tracks. The sound of a musket volley was terrifying. It was a massive, deafening roar that filled the air with thick grey smoke. The smoke was a big problem. After a few volleys, the entire battlefield could be covered in a dense fog. Soldiers could barely see the enemy, or even their own comrades standing next to them. They had to rely on the sound of drums and the orders shouted by their officers to know what to do. Fighting in this smoke was confusing and frightening. It required immense discipline. Soldiers had to learn to stand their ground, reload their weapons calmly, and wait for the order to fire, even when they couldn't see what was coming. To deal with the slow reloading time, commanders developed new tactics. One of the most famous was the counter-march. This involved arranging the musketeers in deep formations, maybe 10 lines deep. The first line would fire their muskets. Then, they would turn around and march to the back of the formation to reload. As they were moving, the second line would step forward and fire. Then the third, and so on. This created a continuous rolling fire. It was like a machine that never stopped shooting. An enemy army advancing towards this would face a constant hail of bullets, making it almost impossible to get close. For centuries, the knight on horseback was the king of the battlefield. Clad in head-to-toe plate armor, armed with a lance and sword, they were a terrifying sight. Their charge could break through lines of ordinary foot soldiers with ease. Their armor could stop arrows and deflect sword blows. They were the elite, the nobles who trained for war their entire lives. But the musket changed all of that. A simple lead ball fired from a musket could punch right through the strongest and most expensive plate armor. Suddenly, a lifetime of training and a fortune in equipment could be ended in an instant by a common soldier with a gun. The knights did not disappear overnight, of course. They tried to adapt. They started wearing even thicker armor, which was incredibly heavy, and made them and their horses tired very quickly. Some even tried to use guns themselves, firing pistols from horseback, but they could never match the firepower of a large group of musketeers on foot. The role of the heavy cavalry charge, which had dominated warfare for so long, began to shrink. They were still useful for chasing down a broken enemy or fighting other cavalry, but the days of them deciding the outcome of a battle by themselves were coming to an end. The age of chivalry was being blown away by gunpowder. Another key figure on the old battlefield was the pikemen. These soldiers carried extremely long spears, called pikes, which could be up to 18 feet long. They would group together in dense squares, like giant hedgehogs. These pike squares were brilliant at stopping a cavalry charge. The horses would refuse to run into the wall of sharp spear points. Pikemen and musketeers learned to work together. The pikemen would protect the musketeers from cavalry, while the musketeers were reloading their slow weapons. This combination of pike and shot became the standard for European armies for over 100 years. It was a partnership born of necessity. However, as guns became better, the need for pikemen faded. A new invention, the bayonet, was the final nail in the coffin for the pike. The bayonet was a long knife that could be fixed to the end of a musket. This turned every musketeer into his own spearman. A soldier could now shoot at the enemy from a distance, and if the enemy got too close, he could use his musket with its bayonet as a short pike to defend himself. Armies no longer needed separate groups of pikemen. The single, multi-purpose soldier, the infantryman with his musket and bayonet, now ruled the battlefield. The age of pike and shot was over. To really understand how much muskets change warfare, we need to look at a specific moment in history. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 is a perfect example. It was a major battle fought in Italy between the armies of France and the Spanish Empire. The French army was led by their king, Francis I. They had a powerful force of noble knights, the famous French gendarmes, who were considered the best heavy cavalry in Europe. They also had a large number of Swiss pikemen, who were tough and reliable mercenaries. The French army was a classic, powerful, late medieval force. They were confident they would win the day. The Spanish army was different. They had cavalry and pikemen too, but their secret weapon was a large group of musketeers. They had around 3,000 soldiers armed with the early musket, the arquebus. At the time, this was a huge number of gunmen to have in one army. The Spanish had been fighting in Italy for years and had learned how effective these new weapons could be. They understood that firepower could defeat traditional courage and armor. Their commander was cautious and clever, and he placed his musketeers in protected positions, behind hedges and along the banks of a stream, waiting for the French to attack. The battle began with the classic French cavalry charge. King Francis I himself led his knights forward, expecting to smash through the Spanish lines as they had done so many times before. But this time was different. As they galloped across the field, the Spanish musketeers opened fire. Hundreds of lead balls ripped through the air. Knights and horses fell in heaps. The charge lost its momentum and fell into confusion. The armor that was supposed to protect the knights was useless against the bullets. The pride of the French army was shot to pieces by common soldiers hiding behind bushes. The defeat was total. The French cavalry was destroyed, their Swiss pikemen were surrounded and cut down, and most importantly, King Francis I was captured on the battlefield. A king had been taken prisoner by the army of his rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This was a massive shock to the whole of Europe. The Battle of Pavia proved without any doubt that the age of the armored knight was over. It showed that disciplined soldiers with firearms could defeat the most powerful and aristocratic warriors. Power on the battlefield no longer came from noble birth, but from gunpowder and discipline. Just as muskets changed war on land, the cannon, truly transformed fighting at sea. For centuries, naval battles were mostly like land battles on water. Ships would get close to each other, and soldiers would try to board the enemy vessel. They would fight hand to hand with swords, axes, and spears. The goal really was to capture the enemy's ship, not to sink it. Ships often had soldiers, like archers, who would shoot at the other crew. But the main event was the boarding action. A ship was mainly a platform to transport soldiers who would then fight a chaotic battle on the decks. The arrival of heavy cannons changed this completely. At first, cannons on ships were small and were used mostly to help the boarding parties, firing at the enemy crew to cause confusion. But shipbuilders and naval commanders soon realized they could use much bigger cannons. They started designing ships specifically to be gun platforms. Instead of carrying lots of soldiers for boarding, they filled the ships with as many cannons as they could fit. These new warships were essentially floating fortresses. Their main purpose was not to capture other ships, but to destroy them from a distance with overwhelming firepower. This led to a revolution in ship design. To carry dozens of heavy bronze or iron cannons, ships had to be built bigger, stronger, and more stable. Shipwrights developed the galleon, a large multi-decked sailing ship. They cut holes in the side of the hull, called gun ports, so that cannons could be arranged along the length of the ship on multiple decks. A large galleon might carry 50, 60, or even more cannons. This meant that the ship's own structure became its main weapon. The power of a warship was no longer measured by how many soldiers it carried, but by how many guns it had and how much weight of cannonball it could fire. This new kind of ship required a new kind of fighting. The old tactic of ramming and boarding was now, honestly, suicidal. If you tried to get close to a galleon, it would simply blast your ship to pieces with its powerful cannons before you could even get your soldiers across. A new tactic developed, called the line of battle. Warships would form a long, single-file line, one behind the other. They would sail past the enemy fleet, also in a line. As they passed, every ship would fire all the cannons on one side of its hull. This was called a broadside. It was a devastating concentration of firepower designed to smash hulls, break masts, and obliterate the enemy fleet from a safe distance. One of the most famous naval conflicts in history, the story of the Spanish Armada in 1588, is, well, a perfect illustration of this new age of sea warfare. King Philip II of Spain, who was the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, decided to invade England. He assembled a massive fleet known as the Invincible Armada, with about 130 ships. These ships were a mix of old and new designs. Many were large, towering vessels built to carry thousands of soldiers. Their main plan was still rooted in the old way of fighting: get close to the English ships, board them with their superior soldiers, and capture them. They had plenty of cannons, but their primary strategy was invasion and boarding. The English fleet that sailed out to meet them was different. Led by commanders like Sir Francis Drake, the English had really embraced the new ideas of naval gunnery. Their ships were generally smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the big Spanish galleons. More importantly, they were designed as pure gun platforms. They carried powerful, long-range cannons, and their sailors were experts at using them. The English plan was simple: stay away from the big Spanish ships and use their superior speed and gunnery to pound the Armada from a distance. They had no intention of letting the Spanish soldiers get close enough to board. For over a week, a running battle took place up the English Channel. The Spanish tried to keep their fleet together in a tight crescent-shaped formation to protect themselves. The smaller English ships darted around them, almost like sheepdogs harassing a flock of sheep. They would sail in, fire a broadside at a Spanish ship on the edge of the formation, and then quickly sail away before the Spanish could effectively respond. The English cannons were better and could be reloaded faster than many of the Spanish guns. While the English didn't sink many Spanish ships in these first encounters, they damaged them and used up the Armada's precious ammunition. The decisive moment came when the Armada anchored off the coast of Calais, France. The English used a terrifying new tactic. They took 8 of their own ships, filled them with flammable material, set them on fire, and sent them drifting towards the anchored Spanish fleet. These were fire ships. In panic, the Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and scattered in all directions, breaking their defensive formation. The next day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English fleet attacked the now disorganized Spanish ships. They sailed in close and unleashed devastating broadsides. The new way of war at sea, based on superior gunnery and maneuver, had triumphed. The broken Armada was then forced to flee home around the stormy coasts of Scotland and Ireland, losing many more ships to the terrible weather. Comparing the world of war before and after the Gunpowder Revolution is, honestly, like looking at 2 completely different worlds. Before gunpowder, personal strength and skill were everything. A knight spent his life learning to fight with a sword and lance. An archer trained for years to develop the strength and accuracy to use a longbow effectively. Warfare was a craft, almost an art form, dominated by a small, aristocratic warrior class and highly trained specialists. Battles could be chaotic, but they were often decided by individual acts of heroism and the clash of steel on steel. The battlefield was a place for personal glory. After the arrival of muskets and cannons, the nature of the soldier changed. The individual hero was replaced by the disciplined group. What mattered now was not how strong you were, but how well you could follow orders. Could you stand in a line, shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other men, and reload your musket in the correct sequence while cannonballs flew past your head? Could you march in step, turn as one unit, and fire when the command was given? War became less about individual skill and more about collective discipline, training, and organization. It became an impersonal, mechanical process of delivering firepower. The new hero was the anonymous soldier, just a cog in a great military machine. The very look and feel of a battle was transformed. Medieval battles were noisy with the clash of swords, the shouting of men, and the thundering of hooves. But gunpowder battles were on another level of sensory assault. The air was filled with the constant, deafening thunder of cannon and musket fire. The battlefield was quickly obscured by a thick, choking blanket of black powder smoke, smelling of sulfur. Soldiers often fought blind, firing at shapes in the fog. Death became something that could come from far away, from an unseen enemy. It was random and impersonal. A stray cannonball could kill a great general just as easily as a common soldier. This shift also had a huge impact on the cost and scale of war. Armor, swords and bows were expensive, but cannons, muskets, gunpowder and cannonballs were fantastically expensive. And you needed huge quantities of them. Furthermore, the new armies were much larger than medieval ones, and these soldiers needed to be paid, fed and equipped all year round, not just for a summer campaign. This meant that only the state, with its ability to raise taxes on a national scale, could afford to wage war. Feudal lords could no longer compete. This concentrated military power in the hands of kings and central governments, helping to create the powerful nation-states we know today. The development of effective muskets and cannons didn't just change how Europeans fought each other. It gave them a massive military advantage over other civilizations around the world. When European explorers, traders, and conquerors began to sail to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought their guns with them. Many of the societies they encountered were powerful and sophisticated, with large armies of their own. But these armies were often fighting with swords, spears, and bows. They were unprepared for the destructive power of European firearms. The sound and fury of cannons and muskets were often enough to cause terror and panic. In the Americas, small groups of Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés against the Aztecs and Francisco Pizarro against the Incas were able to defeat empires with populations of millions. While disease played a huge role in their success, their guns were a key military factor. The sight of a man on a horse, combined with the explosive power of a musket or a small cannon, seemed almost supernatural to people who had never seen them before. The metal armor of the Spanish could protect them from the stone and wood weapons of the native warriors, while Spanish bullets could easily defeat any native armor. This technological gap created a huge imbalance of power. This pattern was repeated across the globe. European trading companies built fortified posts along the coasts of Africa and India. These forts were armed with cannons, which could protect them from attacks by local rulers and also control vital sea lanes. On the oceans, European warships, with their rows of cannons, could defeat almost any non-European fleet. This allowed them to dominate global trade routes, forcing others to trade on European terms. The gunpowder empires of Europe were born from this military superiority. They used their weapons to build vast colonial empires, shaping the political and economic map of the entire world. The consequences of this were enormous and are, honestly, still felt today. The ability to project power across vast distances using gunpowder weapons allowed a few, relatively small European nations to control huge parts of the globe. This led to centuries of colonialism, the exploitation of resources, and the imposition of European systems of government and culture on other societies. While other great empires, like the Ottoman Empire in Turkey or the Mughal Empire in India, also adopted gunpowder weapons, it was the European nations who most effectively combined them with sea power to create the first truly global empires. The roar of the cannon became the sound of a new world order being forged through force. The story of muskets and cannons is more than just a chapter in military history. Their arrival marked a fundamental turning point for society, politics, and the very idea of a nation. The incredible expense of creating and maintaining these new gunpowder armies and navies meant that the power became centralized. Only a king or a central government could raise the vast sums of money needed through national taxation. This spelled the end for the old feudal system, where individual lords with their own castles and private armies held much of the power. The castle, once a symbol of a lord's strength, became obsolete when it could be smashed to rubble by cannon fire. This centralization of power led to the rise of the modern nation-state. Kings and queens created professional bureaucracies to collect taxes and manage the logistics of their new, permanent armies. These standing armies, loyal only to the state, were a powerful tool for enforcing the king's will, both at home against rebellious nobles and abroad against other countries. The shared experience of serving in a national army also helped to create a sense of national identity among people who might previously have only felt loyalty to their local village or lord. The state, with its monopoly on organized violence, became the most important institution in people's lives. The scientific and industrial developments spurred by the arms race were also profound. The need for better guns and stronger cannons drove innovation in metallurgy, chemistry, and engineering. Gunsmiths and cannon founders were some of the most advanced engineers of their day. The quest for more powerful gunpowder led to a deeper understanding of chemical reactions, the precise measurements needed for ballistics, the science of how a cannonball flies through the air, encouraged new developments in mathematics and physics. In many ways, the military-industrial complex that we know today has its roots in this early gunpowder revolution and the constant demand for better, more deadly weapons. In the end, the legacy of muskets and cannons is written across the map of our modern world. They created the powerful centralized states that still form the basis of our international system. They enabled the age of European exploration and colonialism, creating global empires and connecting the world through trade and conflict in ways that had never been seen before. The principles of warfare they established, the focus on firepower, discipline, and logistics, continued to evolve, but they laid the foundation for how wars would be fought for the next 300 years. The bang of that first primitive cannon echoed through history, and we are all still living in the world it helped to create.